Hey, Rod, it is great to have you on the show. I actually think you're the first guest we've had from Great Britain, and we've done over 100 podcasts, so it's overdue. We're glad to have you. Will you please introduce yourself to the audience, give them a little background, and tell them what you're up to?
Sure. So my name is Roderic Yapp. I run my own leadership development company called Leadership Forces. My background, I suppose my place to start is my first career. I was a commissioned officer in the Royal Marines. Joined in 2005. I served for 7 years. I was lucky enough to lead troops in the front line in Afghanistan, get civilians out of Libya in 2011 when the Gaddafi regime collapsed very suddenly. And then towards the end of my career, I specialized in counter-piracy and was lucky enough to lead the recapture of a 55,000-ton container ship from pirate control. I left the Marines in 2012, having done everything I wanted to do. It was a fantastic period of my life, and I left with absolutely no regrets. I got some really good experience, really good advice when I left, which was go and do something completely different because it will create a really rich and learning environment. So I went from the military into uranium enrichment. So I went and worked for a company called Urenco, who have a site in the north of England. I think they've also got one in New Mexico as well. And they effectively enrich uranium for the nuclear fuel process. And my job there focused on operational excellence. I've got no background in anything particularly scientific. I did ancient history at university. And what I realized there was that, hang on a sec, whilst most people understand how to enrich uranium, what people don't really understand is how to lead teams. People here have been promoted because they're good at doing the job. So you're a good maintenance technician. Now you're the head of maintenance. But we're not going to give you any training or any sort of support in order to become a leader. And the way I sort of think about that is that's like promoting the best musicians in the orchestra and then saying, right, now you're the conductor, but we're not going to give you any training on how to be a good conductor. The jobs are two completely different things, but because as an organization you've reinforced the skill set that you've rewarded someone before, they tend to do kind of more of that stuff rather than more leading. And I realized that was a problem. So in 2015, I decided to found my own business. And that's what I've been doing for the last 5 years.
Well, that's great. So I really want to get into what you're doing on the leadership side. And by the way, thank you for serving. Us people, civilians, are very thankful for people that step up like yourself. And I do appreciate that. I was wondering, though, in the light of this COVID crisis type of thing, we might spend just a few minutes where you can get perspective on, what's going on in Great Britain and then dive into the leadership stuff. Normally, we wouldn't do this, but obviously it's different times. So most of our audience is Americans, although they're widespread. I know we've got listeners in Australia, India, throughout the world. But what's going on there in Great Britain, and not only what you're seeing locally, neighborhood wise, but with your clients?
So I'm thinking of this almost in terms of just one day at a time, and for me, this is like COVID day 4 because things have happened so rapidly in the last few days that it's kind of hard to keep up. So went into the weekend, I had some friends over and we were sort of all kind of talking about it. But there hadn't been any really sort of significant changes by, I think, Monday the 16th of March. Then at the end of the day, our Prime Minister said people need to work from home. They need to not make any non-essential journeys, gatherings of people, whilst they didn't say couldn't happen, were, I think, recommended not to happen. And off the back of that, I was meant to spend 3 days working on client sites in London this week. All of them were cancelled as people sort of moved away from London, moved to work from home. So effectively, my revenue from a business perspective has completely sort of fallen off a cliff. Sold work that I'd planned to deliver over the next sort of 2 months has just been pushed back into Q3, Q4 this year. From a civilian perspective, we are starting to see elements of kind of stockpiling of goods. So things like hand wash, the kind of hand soap, the stuff that you can use without water, toilet paper, certain things like pasta, tinned goods are starting to go off the shelves relatively quickly. You're starting to see supermarkets try and get a grip of that. Their supply chains, I think, are able to manage. But put it this way, if you go into a supermarket towards the end of the day, you're getting the things that certainly they have run out of kind of key goods. So things like eggs. They didn't have any eggs yesterday when I went into the supermarket, for example. It's not a crisis, but you are starting to notice elements of, I guess, different consumer behavior in the UK. The Prime Minister, as of yesterday, closed all the schools with the exception of educating kind of key workers. So people that work in our health service, delivery drivers, they will be able to send their children to school, but everyone else will have to bring them home. The knock-on consequences of that are, so what we're now going to have a sort of two-tier education system with some people being educated and others not. For working parents, that's incredibly stressful because we can't call in the grandparents, we can't call in our in-laws to be able to sort of support because they're at risk. So we're trying to kind of work out what is it we do next. And my wife and I need to have a conversation over the weekend to sort of go, right, what does a week in the life of look like for the Yapp household as of Monday? Because we're going to have the kids at home. I'm going to be trying to do some work. I'm one of those people that believes where there's a change in circumstance, there is an opportunity, but you need to find it. So I am rapidly creating a sort of set of online webinars that I can deliver, as well as kind of a sort of business case for like, why would I be interested in delivering these now? So that's kind of what I've been working on.
Forgive me for interrupting, but I think you're right on track. I actually posted something on Medium, a revised newsletter I did. Like, I think I posted it yesterday, just saying, hey, if you think about it, the smartest people right now are planning and executing things with the idea this COVID thing ends at some point.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I got to do certain things today.
Yeah.
But I also have to spend a portion of my time preparing for when this ends. And I'm going to make the most of it when it ends. And I was on the phone just before this podcast with one of my clients and a young manager who was thrown into the role. And, I've been hired to coach her. And she brought up how, part of the benefit of this, now everybody's working from home and she's managing IT techs. Okay. Mm-hmm. That are providing remote support, and usually they go on site a lot. But it's actually had some benefits. It's built up her communication skills. She has participated with them on resolving tickets, so she understands from a tech perspective a little more on what it's like to be a tech. And so it's an opportunity to really build some skills if you, number one, don't get caught too much in the firefighting, totally. We're just trying to hold it together. Or if you have workers that aren't, fully busy, what an opportunity to work on their leadership skills or work on their communication skills or their teamwork skills, something like that. As a matter of fact, Pat Lencioni just sent out this morning a link to his TEDx talk about his the way he hires and the 3 virtues that he looks for. Humble, hungry, and smart. And he talked about the need to really do teamwork. So it sounds like, you're going to be doing some important work that can be very valuable.
Well, I mean, I hope so. I like to, every business every organization serves someone. So the question for me is, how do I set you guys up for success? As my clients, how do I help? And I really don't necessarily know what the answer is, but you guys tell me, what do you need? And if I can offer something that helps develop your people so that in 3 months' time, they have a different way of thinking about this, this is fertile ground to develop some resilience skills. We just need to help them think about it in the right way. And if the finances are a problem, well, look, I trust you. In fact, all of my relationships are very personal. So I'll give you 60 or 90 day terms on invoices if that helps you. Like, I trust you. I know that you'll pay me. I think if you give first, it creates a sort of reciprocity and a generosity that works quite well. So that's kind of what I mean focusing on. But equally, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking other people, there's a bit of a race to get this stuff out there. It needs to be high quality and it needs to be delivered quickly. So for me, I've kind of set myself a target that I would have produced probably a sort of 20-page document of a series of webinars, most of which I've delivered already for private clients that I can roll out very, very quickly, that are relevant to the environment we're in now, so that I don't have to rely too much on my cash reserves. I think that this, certainly in the UK, this is like a liquidity race because your costs stay the same, but for a lot of organizations and even, pubs, clubs, cafes, restaurants, their revenue falls off a cliff. So survival is a liquidity race, and that's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, it's a very unique time.
Completely.
So let's shift over and let's talk about leadership, because you've got some unique perspective on that based on your experience. I mean, I always think it's fascinating to talk with someone who has a solid military background, because the military trains things that we don't see in civilian life just because of the environment you're in, but then how you've transitioned that to the work you do with clients. So what are your thoughts? Where do you want to start on where you are in leadership?
So I think it's almost a good place to start is with the word, which as we sort of briefly talked about before we went live, the word leadership I think is often quite unhelpful. The reason being is because it means so many different things to so many different people that it creates almost a vacuum around clarity, what it sort of actually means. I liken it a bit to the word religious. So my mother is religious, goes to church regularly. You would describe her as someone that lives in line with the Christian values. However, someone that flies a plane into the side of a building or someone that blows themselves up on the streets of Iraq is equally religious. And when you think about it, actually, the religious kind of element or how that individual thinks about themselves is irrelevant. It's all about behavior. That's what it comes down to. So I think leadership is about behavior. I think behavior is something that you do by example. But then the thing about behavior is that it is shaped by context. So a lot of people in the leadership developmental space will say, leadership is all about empowering people. It's about pushing decision-making down to the lowest level. And 99% of the time, I would agree with that. So when we were in Afghanistan, I had to educate my Marines, some of whom would be as young as 18, when the right time was to pull the trigger. I mean, there is no greater level of empowerment than that. And I truly believe in empowering people to make decisions. And if they make mistakes, we work out what went wrong and we educate them and we use it as a learning opportunity. However, David, if you and me were to sort of walk across the road and see someone get hit by a car in a busy city, the last thing you would probably want me to do is turn to you and go, do you think it's the right thing to call the ambulance? I'm empowering you technically, but you can see how in that example, it's a completely inappropriate way of behaving. So I think of leadership kind of in a number of ways. There's this sort of set of foundations, a kind of set of, I guess, principles that if you don't have, you cannot be effective, kind of no matter how hard you try. So this first one is sort of understanding the context, but equally understanding yourself, knowing, like, do you have a natural affinity towards, for example, empowering people, or are you a bit of a control freak like I am, and you have this sort of secret, ridiculous underlying belief that no one can ever do anything sort of quite as good as you? I know that, by the way, that is completely flawed thinking, but I do that does exist inside my head. I kind of have to catch it before it kind of comes out in a behavior. You have to be aware of kind of the impact of your emotions and your feelings and how that impacts your behavior. I think the other things are sort of creating clarity. You've got to create clarity in organizations, and most of the time it doesn't exist. So on a strategic level, it's about setting a clear vision for the future. You're kind of JFK, man on the moon by the end of the decade, all the way down to in your meetings saying things like, guys, it felt like there was an action there. Who was going to do what by when? That's a really powerful thing to say in a meeting. And then writing it down as well, writing it down to make sure you hold that individual to account. I think leaders are comfortable making decisions with imperfect information. If you don't make decisions, if you choose to kick decisions down the road or delay, you are choosing to burn time. Now, that might be unconscious, but there are no organizations that can choose to burn time, because effectively what you're doing is, I guess, reducing the ability for the organization to execute and reducing the agility for the organization. And the last two things kind of that sit on the foundations are this sense of two-way accountability. So I say what I'm working on. I say, right, these are the areas that I'm focusing on, and I want you to hold me to account. These are the ways in which I'm trying to get better. I want you to hold me to account. And you can do that if you sort of create a sort of level of psychological safety. But equally, you have to hold your team members to account. And that can be as simple as saying, hey, look, you said you were going to do this. You said you were going to turn up at this time. I just want you to notice that you didn't. There's a gap between what you said and what you did. Now, you can do that in a really calm way, and that person will feel that slight ting of, I need to get better. And that's okay. That's all right. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the way in which you convey that message, which I think is important. And the last point is, and I don't think anyone has ever done this, is, you can't lead people unless you've got the ability to build strong relationships based on trust. And I know you have it in the US, we have it in the UK, The Apprentice, and you get all of these people sort of saying, look, I'm not here to make friends. I am here to complete this task and to get stuff done and to achieve excellence. And it's like, well, hang on a sec. Let's think about this. How many people have you worked for where you could say, yeah, that was a really inspiring leader, but I also hated them? That doesn't exist. It's a completely flawed way of thinking, and it's surprising sort of how common it is. So self-awareness, understanding the context, being decisive, creating clarity, two-way accountability, and building strong relationships, for me, are kind of the foundations. If you can't do those, then you can't sort of step up to the next level.
And it sounds like, just kind of curious, it sounds like you're saying, because you use yourself as an illustration in the thing where you think nobody can do it as good as you, but you've learned that's not true, that these things can be learned. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
100%. I don't think leadership is something that people are born with, in the same way that my ability to throw a ball is, I am born to a certain level, but ultimately it's not going to see me, play quarterback at the Super Bowl. All right. That is a skill that we all start sort of slightly differently when we're born. There is a level of kind of innate talent there, but in order to get to the very top of a game, you have to be working on it. And people that sort of assume that leadership is something that you're born with, I think, are missing the point, because the military has a huge number of really, really strong leaders, also some not so strong leaders, but none of them were kind of born with that genetic leadership gene. It was something that that they were taught how to do, and then the environment, from a kind of 360 perspective, reinforced that. So they were taught that actually it's important to kind of look after people, that you can push them really, really hard, but there is, you can't afford to sort of lose their respect. There are certain kind of non-negotiables.
Now, I'm kind of curious, before you go into another part here, but and forgive me if this is a rabbit trail, but what type of training? What does the training look like in the military? That's one question I have for you. And why don't we stay there for a moment, and then I'll add my second one. I mean, you were there for 7 years. You were put in a leadership role. I don't know whether you entered in a leadership role, but what did it look like? How were you trained? How did they make certain you not only got the knowledge, but you also could apply it?
So I was commissioned into the Marines. So I joined a kind of officer candidate school, if you like, the sort of US equivalent. So I started with 60 other officers. And the way it basically worked is large parts of it followed kind of basic Marine training. So you were taught how to handle a rifle. You were taught how to load, unload various weapon systems, how to live and survive in the field. And that was kind of the 4 terms, the first term of training, the first sort of 15 weeks sort of focused on that, as well as gradually sort of building your physical fitness. Then as you go into sort of the next phase, you start to get taught how to deliver a set of orders. Effectively, how do you come up with a plan? How do you impart that plan to a group of people? And how do you execute it? And then over the course of that term, and in fact, actually over the course of the rest of that year, various people will have command tasks. So 1 or 2 people might be platoon or troop commanders. Other people might be playing the role of a kind of troop sergeant. Other people might be playing the role of sort of corporals. So you get a sense for each of those kind of jobs, if you like. And basically that's it. You learn how to do something, and then over the course of the 15-month period, you get really tight sort of feedback loops. So weekly, you are told, this is what you're on target at, this is what you're doing all right at, this is what you're not good enough at. And because the way the group is managed, if one of you or a couple of you, well, if one of you actually doesn't meet the required standard, all of you can be punished for it. And what that does is it drives a set of interactions that, frankly, people don't have time to mince their words. So it can feel and it can sound really, really harsh, but it's because the conditions are created for us all to sort of think more like a team rather than as individuals. So if people are selfish, and this is really interesting for me to sort of see it, but if people are selfish, people will tell them, listen, mate, I think you're selfish. And they won't use language quite as plain as that, as I'm sure you can imagine. So it sort of creates the environment for people that demonstrate the right behaviors, kind of get included within the group. So if it's clear that you're trying and you're working really hard and you're sort of pushing yourself, people see that and you are included. But if you're not trying hard enough, if you're not learning from your mistakes, pretty quickly people run out of patience with you, and you'll find yourself excluded. And that's kind of how sort of leadership is sort of built. And then of course you go in front of 30 Marines, your first job, I mean, line managing 30 Royal Marines on operations in Afghanistan. There's no other graduate position like that. You know, some of the big consultancies, some of the larger banks or insurance organizations, you know, they promise you a demanding graduate pipeline. You're like, look, I get 15 months worth of leadership training. My first job is line managing 30 people on the front line. You don't even come close to that. So if you treat it like that, then the development curve is kind of like this. And that's kind of how it all works. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I like the different components there, where within the leadership group, it's a large group and anyone can call somebody else out. And so those that aren't good at that, you know, that would avoid confrontation are forced into an environment where they have to. And they can improve in that. And they also see examples, good and bad, of how to do that probably. But the whole concept, which is in varying degrees implemented corporately, where one person fails and it brings down that work group, you know, or that brings down that team. Like, you know, I have some people that do team bonuses. And, you know, if one person messes up, everybody misses their bonus.
And I'm more in favor of that kind of thing. You know, the number of executive teams I work with, you know, I sort of tentatively ask the question, how are you all rewarded? And they say, well, we all get individual bonuses based on the performance of our teams. And I say, well, look, bottom line, do you need to collaborate? Do you need to become a team, or can you afford just to stay as a working group? Because the conditions have not been created to force you guys to rely on each other. And I think that's one of the things that the military does really, really well. I think necessity is the mother of all invention. I think that's true, you know, and I think the environment that we're in now, for example, with this sort of coronavirus stuff, people will find out what they're made of because they have to. And some of these sort of skills, you talk about people that are going through kind of life-changing, diseases or challenges. They talk about this sort of, I didn't have a choice. I had to do it. I had kids. I was suffering, I was fighting cancer. I had to go on every single day. There wasn't a choice just to sort of lie down and take it.
Yeah.
I had to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's good. I typically recommend a blend, like a 50-50, 50% bonus individual, 50% team. One of the funniest stories I had was a client who did this with their tech team. And one guy wasn't carrying his weight and he was going to bring down the whole team. And the bonus for the quarter was like $1,700, which was a lot for these people. And one of the team members invited the slacker out to the parking lot and said, look, I want to explain something to you. I need the team bonus to make my mortgage. So you have two options. You can pick it up so that we can make the team bonus, or we're going to come out here in another 3 weeks and have another conversation. It's not going to be this pretty. Now, I'm not recommending that, but it's kind of, it falls into, the team manages itself and provides some accountability there, which can be valuable, as a leader.
But equally, like, there's something about being challenged by your peers that can be really, really painful. Someone that feels like one of you. And sometimes that discomfort can create the conditions for someone to change, which is what you're looking for.
Yeah. It's good. Yeah. Okay, so you covered your foundational items, which are really important, and then where do we go from there?
So, and I won't go through them all, but I think that if you've got a sense of sort of self-awareness and you can kind of understand the context, the next thing to do is understand where do you sit on a variety of kind of different spectrums. So the example I gave you with you wouldn't want me to say, is it the right thing to do to call the ambulance? That's an example of either command and control on one end or sort of decentralized empowerment on the other end. Now, most people will say it's all about, decentralized empowerment. But for example, if you're if you're leading a really junior team, you might need to tell them what to do, and that's okay. That's good leadership. But if you're leading a group of senior technical engineers, for example, who know what to do, you don't need to get into the detail to that level. And that's where I kind of think of these kind of sort of spectrums. Some other ones that sort of spring to mind are, so there's the control one. There's the combination of challenge and support. So I know you're a parent, so am I. You can probably see parents out there that frankly give too much challenge to their children and they sort of push them too hard. And the boss that comes across like that can often be interpreted as a really sort of hard taskmaster. But equally, the one that's sort of too supportive almost becomes the friend. And too much sort of support doesn't help people to sort of fulfill their potential. It kind of gets them onto easy street. So again, I think knowing your people, knowing where they are, under what sort of level of pressure they're under, allows you to sort of understand that context for that individual and then adjust your approach accordingly. I've got a couple actually here on my screen. I'm just going to jump up. Hold on 1 second.
That's all right.
So I think the other ones are sort of confidence and humility. On the one side, I think most of the time you want to be acting with a certain amount of humility. You want to be asking people for their ideas, and you sort of want to be encouraging them to come forward and help you kind of create the strategies and plans that you're looking to put together. But equally, for example, in the times that we're in now, people want leaders at the head of organizations who say things like, look, I'm going to do absolutely everything we can to make this organization survive. And that means if we all have to take a little bit of pain, like some form of salary sacrifice, I'm willing to be in it with you as well. But we're going to do everything we can before we make anyone redundant. I want you to be really clear on that. Now, that's a very confident style of leading. And given the context, especially the context that we're facing now, people will feel a bit better people are likely to feel better if they believe in that individual and they believe in their confidence. And where I got this from was when my daughter was born, it was quite a complicated delivery. My wife was really struggling. They went into an emergency cesarean. I didn't really know what's going on. I was a little bit scared. Lots of alarms and bleeps and things going on as they're prepping her for surgery. And I turned to this guy who looked reasonably senior. And I was like, can you just tell me what's going on? I don't really understand it. Like, is everything okay? And he just said to me, he said, you hear that noise there? And I was like, yeah. He's like, well, that's the heartbeat. And if that slows, I'll have that baby out of your wife in about 30 seconds. I was like, oh, okay then. And some people might say that that was gusting up against arrogance. And maybe it was, but I didn't care because it made me feel better. And therefore, I would argue that in that context, that was the right way to behave. I didn't want someone who wasn't quite sure of what they were going to do and needed an element of confidence, and it made me feel a hell of a lot better. I think that leaders need to understand whether they are kind of standards and process orientated, like I am, or whether they're sort of particularly creative. And I found that, again, people are on one end of the spectrum or the other. It's unusual for people to kind of have both. If you do, that's really impressive. But often you'll find very creative, artistic, I'm generalizing, media and advertising types find it very difficult to sort of knuckle down and go, what's the one best way of doing this kind of thing? People with a background in lean or operational excellence, often people with a military background, that's one of the first questions they'll ask. What does good look like? You know, what's the one best way to unload a rifle so it doesn't go bang? Okay? Because we come from a world where you can't afford to get things wrong. But again, it's a balance. It's like, at what point do you decide that the standards and the ways in which you do things are holding you back? At what point do you start to go, well, we need to create some space to do things differently? Because if you always do things the same way they've always been done, we're going to be kind of left behind in the race, if you know what I mean. Big picture, and then in the detail, there's kind of one more, which kind of makes sense for itself. You kind of got to have an understanding of where it is you're trying to go to, but equally kind of get this sense of, how do I balance knowing enough about what's going on in my organization or my team so that if I'm challenged, I can answer with reasonable confidence and I know what people are doing, versus having a sense of where we want to get to in the long term. And the last two spectrums I've come up with relatively recently. So one of them is this ability to be empathetic, which again, most people would say that you need to be empathetic to be a key lead, to be a good leader. And I'm like, yeah, 100% agree with that. But equally, there are times when you may need to be detached. So particularly given given the challenge that we are facing now and the current climate, if you are a really empathetic leader, making people redundant is going to be something that you're really going to struggle to do. And you may run the risk of taking the organization off the edge of a cliff because you can't cut costs. Whereas if you're too detached all the time, it becomes very difficult to know that you're invested in individuals. So again, there's this kind of balance between almost being scientifically detached and making these decisions in the best interest of the whole without the weight of these individuals kind of catching you up.
Yeah, now, I hate to interrupt you before you go to your last one, so save that one. But as I'm listening to you, I'm struck more and more how a leader has to have the ability to make tough decisions in the appropriate amount of time. And I'm curious your thoughts on that, particularly with your leadership experience coming from the military, where, as you've kind of indicated, you know, if you wait too long, you put your team at risk, potentially life-threatening risk. So what are your thoughts on making decisions as a leader?
So I've used this example a number of times, but the VUCA concept, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, there's enough articles written out there that people can kind of go and look at that. The world is a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous place, right? And any piece of information you get is kind of like a photograph. It's like a snapshot in time. The moment you have a sense that you figured it all out, the reality is so many things have changed that whatever you do is going to be imperfect. So what I try and do is encourage leaders to understand that they never have the full picture. They never have perfect data, and to get really comfortable with that. What they have to get better at is making decisions based on completely inadequate and imperfect information, doing what they think is the best thing that they can do in a given situation. In combat, in a firefight, you need to make decisions quickly because you need to get a grip of that situation and you need to seize the initiative and you need to kind of own the environment, because if you don't, they will. And when you get into a contact with the enemy, which is basically when you start shooting at each other, there's an element, or there's a kind of thing that we have in our heads, which is kind of win the firefight. And this, really bluntly, is just an arm wrestle over who can be the most aggressive. Because if people are shooting at you, you put your head down. Now, if you can't see, you don't know where they are, which means they're coming to get you, but you don't know where from. So they now are in control of you, okay? Whereas if you can win the firefight back, if you can start shooting at them and get them to get their heads down, you can sort of turn that on them. So I think getting comfortable making decisions based on imperfect information is a really, really key thing. But equally, when people make mistakes, it's not because there was a kind of lack of intent or they tried to make a mistake. Almost always it's because they made a decision but got it wrong. And I think if you try and hold people to account, or if you try and if you tell them off because they've made a decision and made a mistake, what you're trying to do is help them make better decisions. What you actually do is stop them making decisions, because they've got it wrong once, so they become afraid of making a call the next time. And so they keep coming back to you to ask for direction and guidance. And whilst you might find that quite annoying, that's based on the context that they have been faced with and the previous decisions and the leadership shadows that have had an impact on them. So you need to sort of re-educate them and say things like, what would you do if I wasn't here? What if you couldn't get hold of me? What if I got hit by a bus on the way into work this morning? This client needed a proposal over the desk now. They want to buy now. What would you do? And you create a learning opportunity, because you get the individual to think for themselves, and then you can go, bang on, or what the hell are you talking about? We're miles away there. Or yes, it's largely that. However, I would maybe change these things. So getting people that kind of habit, I think, is really powerful.
I forget where I heard it, whether it was a guest or whoever, but somebody was talking about one of the things that really strengthened their team was that it was after each project or after each incident, they always did I'm using the wrong term, but a recap. They did a walkthrough. Okay, what went right? What went wrong? What can we learn from this? And because they did that thoroughly, they were constantly updating a lot of the processes that supported their organization and strengthening the ability of their leaders.
And I think I would thoroughly recommend that, but I wouldn't do it just for the losses. So I've worked in organizations where, you've got a sales team and they hit something and they nail it, and creating it. If you can create an environment where you go, hey, Charlie, what did you do there? Like, let's break that down. How did you find that person? What did you say? What did you do? What was the process that kind of got that across the line? Because some of the things that they will do will be intuitive. But if you can get them to break it out and share it with the other team, you deconstruct the success, which means you can kind of create more of it. I think a lot of the time people just deconstruct why they lost, but they don't really think about why they won. And I think that's equally as important.
Yeah, excellent point. Now, one of the things struck me as you were talking about making the decisions was, can you talk about the depth of the decision? Now, you're using the firefight as an example. And so are you, when you're making those decisions, are you also assessing, okay, how much am I willing to risk with this decision? I mean, am I going to totally put all my people at risk at one time, boom, 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 or is it more kind of like a lean startup model where I'm going to try this thing, I'm going to try that thing, and because if it goes bad, if it goes south, we can recover and go in a different direction. I'm curious what your thoughts are with that. Does it need to be I'm all in, or or does it just totally vary based on the situation?
I think it definitely varies based on the situation, but I would never ever go all in. And this is actually something that I think there's a survivorship bias that a lot of people have, and you get a lot of this advice online, which is you need to go all in and invest everything you've got in order to realize success. And I'm like, I completely disagree with that. So my 4-year-old son can't swim, right? I lob him into a swimming pool. He is all in. He is fully invested in swimming, but he can't do it. So he's probably not going to do very well. And I just think that there's a real danger with going all in, because it kind of leaves you with nothing. And whilst we might hear about the people that went all in and things worked out all right for them, there's 1,000 other people who went all in and it didn't work out very well, and you don't hear about them. So I think there's a survivorship bias at play there. I mean, I was intuitively thinking as we would go through on patrols, what would I do if I was ambushed now? How would I deal with this? I had really, really good people working for me, working with me, troop sergeants, troop corporals. I trusted them implicitly. For me, that made my job a hell of a lot easier, because I knew that I would always have a section that was located at a reasonable distance away, and that if we were in the shit, they'd get us out of it. And I think that brought me a great deal of confidence, actually.
Yeah, great. Well, can you give us that last tip that was coming to mind on your spectrum there? So
the last tip that sort of comes to mind on these sort of spectrums, and again, I like to think about what are most people imparting in terms of advice, and how do I think of that as kind of a bad thing? So how do I deliberately go the other way? And I think at the moment, a lot of people are talking about trusting in data and the importance of data. And again, like, don't get me wrong, I agree with that most of the time. But I'm curious about, to what extent do you trust data on one end of this sort of end of the spectrum? And what else do you trust your gut and your intuition? And I think you need to be careful about how you make space for both. And I came across this story in, I think it was Range, which I think is a really good book by David Epstein. And he talks about the Challenger disaster. And he talks about NASA being an organization which was data-driven, which basically said, look, if you can't prove it to me, I'm not interested. That was kind of the culture that existed within the organization. Now, the trouble with that is, what if I don't have enough data? What if I don't know, but I feel something's wrong? That means that you're basically ignoring me, or you're telling me to sort of go away, but I can't get this intuitive sense that something isn't right up to the people that manage the organization in order to make the right decisions. And the engineers responsible for the O-rings, there's kind of, I don't want to butcher the story, but there was kind of an element of that. They were like, we don't have enough data points. We don't know how these things are going to perform at freezing temperatures. We just don't know. That doesn't mean they're going to perform well, but it doesn't mean they're going to perform badly. But if your organization only listens to the data, and I think huge amounts of Silicon Valley have kind of become trusting in data as if it's the kind of new religion, where's the intuitive sense for the guy that says, it doesn't feel right, something's not right here, this doesn't feel particularly good? And whilst I think I read an article with Sheryl Sandberg, and I think she was challenged on the role of Facebook in the sort of massacre of the Rohingya in Burma. And that was a really good example where they just didn't have the data. They didn't have enough native Burmese speakers to sort of manage the hate speech that was going on and was being used on the platform. It was a complete blind spot, but they kind of didn't even know that. They didn't sort of understand the kind of ethnic tensions on the ground and all those kind of things. And whilst I think, like all of these companies, I think their intent is good, I think you have to create space for intuition. I don't think data gives you everything.
Well,
That's
I think it's a great part of the spectrum, and actually, in some ways, a good way, kind of close out our discussion, because once again, you go back to this COVID situation.
yeah,
We have all this data being thrown at us, but there's a lot of gaps in that data.
yeah,
There's a lot of reporting that's not happening, quite frankly, because there's no way everybody's being tested.
yeah,
It
100%.
significantly varies by country.
Hmm.
And then is China all of a sudden all the deaths, all the infections have stopped? Really?
Yeah,
You know? And so part of me, I want to believe in the data, but I'm like, well, wait a minute. This is a regime who could put out whatever they want to put out. So have they just clamped it down that they don't want to be, the source of fear for, even though they still have, or is it all healed? I have no idea. But there's so many gaps in the data, and people
yeah.
are extrapolating it different ways. I agree with you. You have to have some balance with the subjective side, what your gut feeling is.
And I think in the UK, they've been the sort of chief scientific officer, the government's chief advisor, has been really good at that. His communication has been really crisp. He's been saying, this is the kind of situation, but there is a lot of stuff that I don't know. And I think it's really interesting, people's reaction to that. It's like the government don't know what they're doing. And it's like, no, they don't know.
Yeah,
And you want to be really careful listening to someone that goes, I know what I'm talking about. Because the reality is they're lying to you. It may be through ignorance, but they're lying to you. They don't understand.
yeah,
I think we've got about 2,000 cases in the UK at the moment, but that number's going up obviously every day. But that's that we know of. And we think that the range is between sort of 15 and 35,000 cases, or around that. It's in that ballpark because we just don't know.
yeah.
And that's kind of scary, but that's the world we're living in at the moment. And I think actually there are a lot more situations where we don't know, but we like to think we do.
Yeah, and I think that's my compliments to that person, because they're being authentic, they're being transparent, they're being trustworthy,
Yeah,
and they shouldn't be attacked for that. I mean, that should be complimented. It's like, thank you for being honest. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know,
yeah,
and that's
100%.
what great leaders do, right?
No, completely. And I think that, like, when all this is done, the test for him, which I think he will pass, will be: can I look myself in the mirror and know that I behaved with integrity throughout? Did I tell people the truth at the right time, or did I give them the right amount of information in order for them to make informed decisions? And based on his current performance, I would argue yes. I think he is. I think he's doing a good job. I think it's really easy to criticize, but most people are criticizing from a position of complete ignorance. So I'm perhaps sort of slightly unpopular in this view, but I'm like, look, I think they're doing the best they can. No one sat back with their feet on the sofa going, it'll be all right. They're working as hard as they can to try and solve this. But unless you can provide me with a really clear solution where there's no downsides, then I'm not interested. you know,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
easier to poke holes in the people that are trying to solve this crisis than support them, I guess.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. So, any last word? I mean, this was a great to end on, this whole integrity piece, but anything you want to add as we close out this conversation? This has been great. Really appreciate all the insights, Rod.
No, I'm just sort of trying to think. No, sort of nothing specific. I think, like, one of the things I try and do, and I try and encourage people to do is don't look for simple answers to complex problems. And I think leadership, the relationship that people have with people, culture, all of these kind of things, these are inherently complex. So what you should be trying to do is gather an understanding of as many different models, as many different kind of lenses and ways of viewing the world, and ways in which you can understand a complex subject, in order to sort of kind of grapple with it. Don't read one book and go, that's how you lead people. Because the reality is it's based on an individual's experience. Like, I could write a book on how to lead people, and it would be great if you're going to Afghanistan to lead Marines. The reality is most people aren't doing that. So I think be aware of a model or an individual's experience and their strengths, but equally of the limitations, and also of your own strengths and your own limitations. And hopefully you won't get yourself into too much trouble.
Hopefully, hopefully be much better than that. But that's a great way to end it. Once again, have some balance and a great message for us. So thank you, Rod. Really appreciate you being on the show. And we will be posting information on the site on how people can get a hold of you, and definitely want to do that. If they want to learn more about what you're doing, do you want to just mention that right now? Because we have a lot of people that just listen in.
Sure. So my website is leadershipforces.com, all one word. I write articles up there which sort of talk about kind of, I guess, the things that have sort of occurred to me recently. And I'm an open connector on LinkedIn. So Roderic Yapp, it's a fairly unique name. You'll be able to find me. Just hit me up, and I'll always connect with you.
Super. Well, thank you very much.
No worries. Real pleasure. Thanks very much, David.